clay is capable of the wildest, materially substantial poetry. It comes very close to being a sacred medium. On the other hand, it comes close to being one of the most vulgar mediums man uses. It is at once eternal and absolutely momentary. Things have survived that are 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 years and older, and they can be all smashed to nothing with one hammer.
What is a potter? Who?
What is a potter? It's a person that makes pots. I don't quite know how else to put it.
A potter is somebody who makes pots, and it's a generic term that can mean many things to different people. But generally, people who make pots are potters.
A potter is a sculptor. A potter is a painter. A potter is a dreamer. A potter is a shaman whose arms are around a holy circle. A potter is bringing out into the world like a mother. A potter is a birther.
A potter is a human being who touches clay and of it finds divinity.
It's all romantic crap. Hey, you ever eat off of those handmade plates? You can't get them clean, you know. They get crackled, glazes don't fit, stuff, and they're dangerous to eat off. There's salmonella specials, tell you the truth.
This is a person lost and found in the process of moving Earth. This is a person wrapped up in heat and light and touch and romance and vision.
The poetry of the potter, working with the earth, let's go to the beach and have a raku party. I mean, you know, it's everything I hate about ceramics, you know. Everything but the marshmallows.
I consider myself a potter, but I don't always present myself as a potter. To artists, I call myself a potter. To potters, I call myself an artist.
You must first be an artist before you can be a potter, see? Because pottery is different than dishes.
You asked me what a vessel is. The dictionary says a craft for traveling on water.
Well, you know, a vessel is a vessel per se is it usually holds something. You know, it's a container of some sort, a vessel. Well, it could be a boat, right?
I mean, a boat's a vessel with the water on the outside, and a pot is a vessel with the fluid on the... Wait a second. Did I get that right?
I would say a vessel is that which contains, that which holds, that which finally has womb-like connotations, that which functions almost like a breast.
A vessel is something that has gained a certain kind of borrowed prestige and added value. So it's a kind of an honorific for a pot.
An airship, a hollow or concave utensil, as a cup, bowl, pitcher, vase, used for holding liquids or other contents. That's what we're referring to. Something for holding contents.
I can work with that. I work in vessel forms. I did them all. Little teacups all the way up. And what I'm working on now is a vessel. It's a vessel form. It's holding my spirit. And that is a container of some sort. Doesn't mean you're going to put water or anything in it. No. You put a bunch of flowers in it. No. But it does contain something that I put into it. And that is a container right there. And it does contain me. That is a vessel, you know. And there it is. So you look at it as a vessel.
What's the difference between a pot and a vessel? $5,000.
There are potters who make knickknacks sold in dime stores. There are potters who make vast bowls in a crazed green glaze filled with bubbles. There are potters who make tiny little clay figures. There are potters who record what is happening to us today. Potters, all artists, record what was, what is, and more often than not, what is to be. Clay is earth, earth that has been tempered and worn so that it becomes easily used by the hand.
Well, what's the earth? A bunch of rotten stuff in the ground. Who knows? I might be throwing my own grandmother. Who knows?
Clay is earth, and clay is also flesh in the way it feels.
So it's alive. See, it's alive material. Look, see, I mean, it just doesn't record that, you know? It records that emotion.
So I touched clay and it's changed my whole life. You know, I don't know what it is. It's, maybe I had bad toilet training, who knows?
It's yucky to a lot of people. It has to do with dirt and the organic. I mean, that's precisely why we like it.
So clay is a very primitive material. You get it in the earliest civilizations. Long before the Copper Age or the Iron Age, people were making clay pots. It was the beginning of civilization in a kind of way.
So it's been here forever. It's been waiting for somebody to do something.
Just the same way there wasn't a national tradition of high art in painting and sculpture that was uniquely American, there was no real national tradition in ceramics. The ceramics in America were very derivative from European ceramics.
There was no American tradition in ceramics, really. Not forget the American Indian, you know, and all those great tribes down in the Southwest. They had a history of ceramics that just some of the greatest things that were ever made. But that was the American tradition at that time. So that was good for us. The tradition of no tradition, that's great.
Throughout the first 3 quarters of the 19th century, while European potters produced teacups designed to encourage the ideal positioning of a lady's pinky, American potters were digging in and beginning all over again.
In the 18th century, the question of whether or not there's a uniquely American mode of pottery is colored quite strongly by the fact that we're not Americans, we're British colonials. And the British economic system dictated that the colonies were not permitted to compete with their manufacturers. So the only pottery we could legally make would be rustic wares, folk art, things on a scale that did not compete with the great Staffordshire potteries, the great Wedgwood, the great Minton. The Americans have to kind of keep way below that level or else we'll be shut out of the water. It's not till the 19th century, as you get into the 1800s, when we're our own country, that we start our own fledgling ceramic industry.
To work in a ceramic factory or an industry in the late 19th century was often very inartistic. In fact, it was scut work. The same forms were produced day in, day out, year in, year out. The same work was done day in, day out by the same people. It was comparable in its time to the person who slaps the hubcaps on a car in Detroit. Women often were decorators. Men were glazers, throwers, the potters, the kilnmen. They were the technicians as well as the administrators. One did the work that one was told to do. That work could be the work of a kilnman, a glazer, a thrower, but it's dictated work. So the conditions were not as happy and virtuous as we like to believe. A kiln, that is a firing, could contain several thousand pieces. It depends on the size of the kiln and the size of the objects that are being fired. A firing takes many hours and maybe days. So your work is really designated well into the future. Here's what you will do today, here's what you do tomorrow.
Prior to that time, a craftsman was an artist and an artist was a craftsman. From that time forward, there was a division between the arts and crafts. The division is totally artificial. An artist has to be trained in craft, by which I mean use of the hand, how to do it. He has to be trained in the brain. And at risk of having everybody annoyed, the spirit too.
Unable to compete with cost-efficient manufactories, most potters hired themselves out to one commercial factory after another. In the latter half of the 19th century, however, the regimen of commercial production provoked a backlash called the Arts and Crafts Movement, out of which emerged the first evidence of a uniquely American clay art.
Volumes have been written about why the Arts and Crafts Movement began. I think for want of a clear, simple answer, it began because of what the Industrial Revolution was creating. It was creating havoc.
At the turn of the century, there were some monumental changes in art, which reflected, I think, the changes in social and technological conditions of the day. The Industrial Revolution, which had started perhaps 40 or 50 years earlier, had really taken hold, and it had created a revolt in artists and creative people all over. What you see happening is a great concern amongst artists of all kinds, certainly amongst the potters as well, that in the technology, the artist might become lost from his art, that in the division of labor, the person would be disconnected. And out of that fear came the great changes in the potteries.
The Arts and Crafts Movement was founded in England. It's a natural reaction to the Industrial Revolution, which it was vehemently opposed to.
The two principal advocates for what became the Arts and Crafts Movement were John Ruskin and William Morris. William Morris put into practice what John Ruskin advocated.
They wanted to see the designer and the craftsman united in one person, so that it wasn't a design being imposed on someone who would have to implement it, and that the person who designed it was actually the person who understood the process.
The Arts and Crafts Movement was not just about design reform, it was social reform, and therefore it was political reform. It was a highly politicized movement. It was a movement that was looking to a distant past to deal with the present. It's anti-modernist, but also is an anachronism when you consider that the machine world was moving inexorably into the future.
In America, we have much more of a focus on the object itself and the crafts, and much less of a focus on political reforms that we find happening within the movement in England. And so wherever the machine can relieve tedium, it is freely admitted into the process, and that's the compromise that makes it much more popular in America than it really ever was in England.
Modernism in America, pottery in America, social change in America, all of these are intertwined, and perhaps most deeply affected are the women. It's the women who are first involved in China painting, who commandeered great potteries, hired hundreds of people, and developed modern American idioms.
Begun as a naive challenge to commercial industry, the Rookwood pottery emerged at the forefront of the American art pottery movement.
In 1876, with the start of the Philadelphia Centennial and the introduction of China painting, many of women in America became interested as an avocation in the idea of getting together socially to paint and decorate pottery. And out of a social event grew great potteries, major potteries like Rookwood, which won gold prizes in Paris for the work that was developed.
The Rookwood Pottery Company of Cincinnati was founded in 1880 by Maria Longworth Nichols.
Maria Longworth Nichols was a member of one of those China painters groups in Cincinnati, and she had been to the exposition in Philadelphia, and she was among those who was so outraged at America's lack of success in comparison to European wares that she came back to Cincinnati determined to experiment and close that gap. She came from a wealthy family. She was able to persuade her father to fund what became the first state-of-the-art pottery in America, the Rookwood pottery.
Mrs. Nichols didn't really have a philosophy when she founded Rookwood. She had an idea. The idea was to create artistic ceramics.
Up to that time, there had not been any pottery purely devoted to art pottery. Most art pottery that was even conceived of was a sideline in an industrial operation. And Rookwood was a pottery built to be a studio pottery, an art pottery for artists to come and focus on ceramics and pottery as art and not necessarily simply utilitarian vessels and tablewares.
Compared to large ceramic factories, Rookwood pottery was an enlightened place to work. William Watts Taylor, who was the business manager, sought to nurture the employees, especially the decorators, by giving them time for lectures, outings, riverboat rides, picnics, and so forth. At the same time, though, we have to think of the company as a business. On the business side, Taylor did have time and motion studies made. He was careful to nurture the corporate image of the pottery through advertising, through retailing, and other measures to ensure that the company was always in the public eye.
Rookwood is often given credit for developing a special type of decoration. It's a type of decoration in which thick slips were used under the glaze to create really almost a painting on the pot.
Rookwood straddles two traditions, traditional ceramics and art. The artistry of the pottery is primarily in the finish and in the decoration. It is, in effect, canvas painting given three-dimensional form in clay.
Rookwood set the standard for art potteries in the early part of the century. And part of that was the fact that they originated this atomizer technique of being able to do a background that was gradiated. And other art potteries, such as Weller, were very envious and imitative of Rookwood ware.
Every piece at Rookwood was intended to be artist-designed, artist-created. There came a point in Rookwood's production when, purely for commercial satisfaction of demand, they began producing a design over and over and over.
Rookwood was in many ways like Camelot. It began with a glorious ideal, began with an intention to create something that had never been created, and then became a victim of itself, of other forces beyond its control, and ended on a sad note, having become an anachronism, having become a passé tradition.
Rookwood had women involved in ceramic production, but they were relegated to certain positions. Women were considered to be china painters. That was sort of the clean part of the job. But generally, women china painters were not seen as originators of an idea or of a design.
Out of that china painting tradition grew an expertise which, of course, wanted to go a step further. There emerged a number of women who distinguished themselves as art potters and not simply china painters. The greatest of them all, I think, would have to be Adelaide Alsop Robineau.
Dissatisfied as a china painter limited to the stereotyped spray of flowers and the inevitable butterfly, Adelaide Alsop Robineau dropped her decorator's brush in 1903 and and within 8 years became America's first world-renowned potter.
Robineau is important for a number of reasons. As I mentioned, she was a china painter, but she very early on became interested in far more than china painting. She was determined to start working in porcelain, which is something most potters feared, porcelain being the hardest of the ceramic bodies to work with. She was obviously driven by a strong motivation to achieve the finest quality on line with the European ceramicists, and she did.
Following a series of lessons written by Taxil Dewa, the master potter at the Sèvres Pottery in France, Robineau consolidated her understanding of the complex porcelain-making process. Setting up a studio next to her Syracuse home, Robineau embarked on an arduous series of tests with delicate porcelain compounds and crystalline glazes. "Every one of the new pieces is warped and blistered," her husband Samuel complained. "I have never felt so disgusted and discouraged. I think anybody foolish enough to do porcelains ought to be shut up in an insane asylum."
Robineau's work is extraordinary because she was able to take the medium of porcelain and really exploit its finest characteristics. I think the thing we associate most with her is her extraordinary carving. Porcelain's fired at such a high temperature, it becomes extraordinarily hard and can be worked very finely and still retain its strength. So Robineau would carve the porcelain to limits that one could never achieve with coarser bodies.
Adelaide Robineau's work was absolutely obsessive. For hours carving this scarab vase, said to be 1,000 hours of work. It's very work and labor intensive. But for her, I think it's a very rewarding experience because it allows her the vehicle to excel in an area where nobody had done so before.
Despite Robineau's achievement, perhaps no one fulfilled the ideals of the art pottery movement better than George Orr. "Rookwood is a fraud. My name is Mud, the unequaled, unrivaled, undisputed greatest potter on earth. You contradict."
Orr was one of those strange, idiosyncratic American characters that seemed to emerge, and it did emerge in the 19th century.
After learning basic techniques visiting potters throughout the South, George Orr, the mad potter of Biloxi, mastered every facet of ceramics and virtually refashioned them in his own image. Fiercely independent, Orr dug his own clay out of Mississippi riverbeds, built his own potter's wheel, and invented a variety of glazes that have never been duplicated.
Orr was just simply idiosyncratic and disagreed with everything that was going on, and suddenly saw the medium as one in which he could be very self-expressive.
According to the good book, Orr said, "We are created from clay, and as nature's had it, no two of us alike. So I make disfigured pottery. Couldn't and wouldn't make it any other way."
I mean, the man was crazy. I mean, wonderfully crazy, you know? He did things to... His vessel forms were his takeoff for art. And he would turn them side out and inside out. And nobody would do this.
If Orr's pots were art, then their museum was the Biloxi Art and Novelty Pottery. After a visit, critic Lyle Saxon reported that there were shelves filled with pottery, some classic, others distorted, willfully misshapen. Never have you seen work which bore the mark of the maker to such a degree. You are holding a teapot beautifully executed, yet you are shocked at the perverse pot next to it. You can hear the potter chuckle as he turned it on the wheel, slapping the face of conventional art. Orr has tired of the beautiful and found joy in the bizarre. You find yourself liking the potter immensely.
I think Orr prided himself on being radical, on pushing clay in ways and means that it had never been exploited before. He tortured his vessels into new shapes. He created glazes that one had not seen before in American ceramic history. And he prided himself on being as bizarre and as outside the norm as possible.
He had gigantic moustaches. He would often stand on his head. He was an exhibitionist. And he decided to make some very exhibitionist pottery that was strange. It was even overtly sexual. So much so, he was teaching at a women's college, and they fired him because of the sexuality of his pottery.
Come on, boy, let's do that. Art critics of the day were unimpressed. Mr. Orr suffers from his efforts to make it original at any cost of beauty and aesthetic charm. It is the lack of good proportion, of grace, and of dignity that makes it fail to produce the effect a work of art should. Uninterested in holding a job, unable to stay too long in any one place, Orr often took his show on the road. Traveling along with exhibitions and carnivals throughout the South, Orr sought the notoriety he felt he deserved as the unequaled, unrivaled, undisputed, greatest art potter on earth. He never found it.
George Orr's importance rests in the fact that he proves a nut can win.
Poor George Orr felt terribly neglected, but he achieved what he wanted to about 60 years after his death, unfortunately.
In 1969, the 11,000 pieces that Orr had created for posterity were discovered in the attic of his son's auto shop. Upon seeing Orr's delicate yet structurally sound pots firsthand, many contemporary potters regarded Orr's techniques so sophisticated they considered him the most expert thrower that's ever lived. I am making pots for art's sake, for God's sake, and for future generations. When I am gone, my work will be prized, honored, and cherished.
So he comes out of nowhere, not caring what the world thinks, doing what he wants to do.
His importance was that he indicated one did not have to be a part of the messy mob in the mud. Cut.